Hello again. This video is going to be entitled We the People. Unfortunately, most people think that means everybody in America, and it never has. And I'm going to show it to you in this video. We the people have always been the popular leaders and the elite. And when they created the Constitution for the United States in 1787, or thereabouts, they were creating a government for themselves, for their posterity, not for the allodial free man living in Western Virginia, or the allodial freeholder like the Green Mountain Boys up in Vermont and New Hampshire. They were creating a government for themselves to protect their commercial interests. They were the ruling elite. And this is why today you have a problem in America, why you are the chattel human resource and the elite power structure still owns you. Now, wasn't always that way, but you have contractually bound yourself to be their chattel human resources through birth certificates. Go see the first video in this series called Did You Intend to Make the State Your Daddy or Your Father? Talking about parents patrie. So with this, I want to start off first. I think I've covered, the idea of what a nation is. A nation, state, country all means the corporate body politic of people joining together to form a government, civil government that now exercises power over them. So this first quote here is from Lysander Spooner. Where's my mouse? Oh, there it is. From Lysander Spooner from a treatise that he wrote called No Treason. And I'm going to read this for you. The question still remains, how comes such a thing as a nation to exist? How do millions of men scattered over an extensive territory, each gifted by nature with individual freedom, required by the law of nature to call no man or body of men his masters, authorized by that law to seek his own happiness in his own way, to do what he will with himself and his property, so long as he does not trespass upon the equal liberty of others, authorized also by that law, to defend his own rights and redress his own wrongs, and to go to the assistance and defense of any of his fellow men who may be suffering any kind of injustice. How do millions of such men come to be a nation in the first place? How is it that each of them comes to be stripped of his natural, God-given rights and to be incorporated, compressed, compacted, and consolidated into a mass with other men whom he never saw, whom he has no contract, and towards many of whom he has no sentiments but fear, hatred, or contempt? How does he become subject to the control of men like himself, who by nature had no authority over him, but who command him to do this and forbid him to do that, as if they were his sovereigns and he their subject, and as if their wills and their interests were the only standards of his duties and his rights, and who compel him to submission under peril of confiscation, imprisonment, and death? Clearly, all this is the work of force or fraud or both. Now, the one thing I would add here to Lysander's final statement is that he missed consent. If I can get you to consent to me to be your master by contract through your application, or because you've asked me for some sort of protection or benefit and I provide it to you, well, now you owe me. And that's the greatest way men can get other men to submit to them and be ruled over them. When you create, this is very important, listen to this. When you create offices of power, The people who seek power will seek office. A good man who does not want to exercise power over his enemy or over his neighbor or over anyone will not seek an office of power. Why? It's an anathema to him. He would not want to be in a position to make decisions for his neighbor. He wants to set his neighbor free or fight to keep his neighbor free. But I can't do anything to free you. Nothing I can do. You have to free yourself. Just as you're the one that contractually bound yourself, you're the one that has to free yourself. Now let's move on. Understanding, how does this corporation called a nation, state, or country come into existence? Force, fraud, consent, or a little of all three. Okay, now let me change pages here and find my mouse again. I want to take you to, I put this on the screen, but it's actually out of this book right here called Summary of American Law by George Clark. And it's just easier to do on the screen. Some of the books I've got down here, but I get too many books out and then it's all over the place. So this is from that book, and it's from a section called Constitutional Law, Chapter 1, Section 1, Making and Amending Constitutions, page 462, again out of that book that I just showed you. So it says, quote, if a constitution expressly provides that it may be amended only in a certain way, and another way is followed, such an attempted amendment is illegal. But if it is acquiesced in, it becomes effective as a peaceful revolution, such as took place when the United States Constitution took effect upon the ratification by 9 states, in spite of the fact that the old Articles of Confederation provided that they should not be amended without unanimous consent of the states. Again, that's from Summary of American Law, George L. Clark, Constitutional Law, blah, blah, blah. George L. Clark was a former member of the law faculties at Stanford, Illinois, Michigan, Missouri, and New York universities. And here's my little note. In a pure republic, and republic comes from res publica, which means things public, but it really evolved from the original thought, which is in the positive versus, or in the negative versus the positive, is libera res publica, which means free from things public. Now, let's ponder that for just a minute. In your current situation, how many things have you contractually bound yourself to that are public? Public policy, public law. Do you use public roads and public libraries and attend public schools and go to public parks and go to businesses that are open to the public? You see, public is what you're bound in as a member of the corporation. You do everything through the public. You might call some things private, but they're not really private because they're publicly controlled and regulated and licensed. You see, even a business that you say, well, I've got a private business. No, you don't. If your business was actually private, you would not be engaged in commerce. You would not have bank accounts or insurance or public licensing or permits to engage in doing commercial business in the public that affects the public. And we've talked a little bit about that. We may go over that again as time progresses in this series. Okay, so the rights of the individual freeman, which is an allodial freeholder, is superior to the will of the majority in any true pure republic, libera res publica. But once you're a corporate member in the democracy, the body politic that's a representative democracy, now you're part of the public, and the majority rules the public will through public policy. Oh, ouch. Therefore, any action the collective corporate body politic takes must be done with unanimous consent of all the individuals or all the parties involved, such as all the states. Remember, we're talking about this quote. So why did they, in the original Articles of Confederation, say that this could not be amended without unanimous consent of all the parties, all the states that had ratified this Article of Confederation? Because they're following this Republican form of government principle that is critical. That unanimous consent of all the parties or all the individuals has to be, that's how it happens. You can't force anyone to do something by the will of the majority. So majority rule, mob rule, is an anathema to a pure republic, but it is a vital component of socialism, corporatism, statism, communism, fascism, all of that. Those are all the same form of system. It's just whether or not they're tyrannical or not. Tyranny and these systems are not automatic. They always devolve into tyranny, but they don't always start off that way. And then we see a couple of quotes here. Democracy is indispensable to socialism. Lenin said that. And democracy is the road to socialism by Karl Marx. So here we see that, okay, right off the bat, the Constitution was a peaceful revolution because it only, in its writings, said that it would take effect if only 9 of the 13 ratified. And we know right away the ratification process was very heated. And even it was North Carolina and Rhode Island, I believe, didn't ratify right away, and they didn't even take part. They weren't allowed to take part in the election of George Washington, the first president of the United States under the Constitution. Remember, there was a whole bunch of other presidents of the United States under the Articles of Confederation. George Washington was not the first president of the United States. He was the first president of the United States under the Constitution, the peaceful revolution. Okay? All right. But now let's see what else we can find here. Let's read about this as a book. It's actually a series of books. This is volume 1. It's called The March of Democracy by James Truslow Adams, The Rise of the Nation. And this is starting on page 257. This is kind of talking about how the ratification of the Constitution was very heated. So we're just going to start here where I've got it highlighted. Some of the small states ratified promptly. Okay, Delaware, December 7th, New Jersey, December 17th, 1787, Georgia, January 2nd, and Connecticut on the 9th of 1788. Meanwhile, there was a great struggle going on in some of the most important states. In Pennsylvania, the majority of the people were probably opposed to the suggested Constitution. But those in favor of it rushed a call for the convention through the assembly before their opponents had time to organize, and ratification was announced December 12th of 1787. Okay, so have you ever taken part of that? We had something like that happen here in the little community I'm a part of. People have been trying to get a public swimming pool because the old one was damaged and they couldn't fix it. It just wasn't worth it. So they wanted to raise money for a new one. Of course, they didn't want just a swimming pool. They wanted to now tax the heck out of people to create a water park. And they voted that several times, and the people always said no, because this is an elderly community. A lot of people on fixed incomes, not a lot of wealth, and taxes go up pretty quickly. They always try to hide it, but enough of us were smart enough to kind of counter that. Well, what they ended up doing was having a special election in August when people were on vacation or not paying attention, and very low turnout. And of course, the people that turned out were the people that wanted it. So, but they ended up having to scale back the scale of the water park. But they still voted it in by forcing a special election in the middle of off-season time. So most people didn't. The people that didn't have time to organize against it, it was done very quickly. So you can see they did that here as well to get the Constitution passed. Okay? In the convention in Massachusetts, the anti-federalists, Now, if you've never read the Anti-Federalist Papers, I suggest you read a copy of the Anti-Federalist Papers. In fact, my avatar, I use Melanchthon a lot as an avatar, and that's for Melanchthon Smith, who went by, was one of the gentlemen. There were 2 or 3 of the Anti-Federalists that wrote under the name Federal Farmer, and I've actually used that avatar too. So Melanchthon Smith was one of the ones who wrote the Anti-Federalist Papers along with Richard Henry Lee. He used Federal Farmer, and a couple others too, used that pseudonym. So in Massachusetts, the Anti-Federalists were in a majority, and ratification after much anxiety was attained by only a sharp political deal with John Hancock, the presiding officer, who was inveigled into thinking he might be the first vice president if the new government were formed, and by gaining power over other delegates by appropriate means. Sam Adams, provincially minded as ever, was also opposed, but in February, the Massachusetts Convention, by a very narrow margin, voted for ratification, provided certain amendments might be offered to the other states for adoption. Just as the Revolutionary Adams opposed the Constitution in Massachusetts, so did Patrick Henry in Virginia, and the contest in that most important state of all was prolonged and bitter. He who in Stamp Act days had proclaimed that there should be no Virginians or New Yorkers but only Americans, now declaimed as violently against the preamble of the Constitution because it began, "We, the people of the United States," instead of "We, the states." He nailed it, because they're the parties to the Constitution, not the allodial free man in America. We, the states. The states are the ones to create the United States, not the people. The we the people are the guys who drew up the Constitution and presented it to the states for them to approve the contract. That's who we the people are, the guys who signed the Constitution and their posterity. Okay, like many, he feared a consolidated government and the loss of states' rights. Not only Henry, but much abler men such as George Mason, Benjamin Harrison, Monroe, and Richard Henry Lee were also opposed and debated with Madison, John Marshall, Wyeth, and others in what was the most acute discussion of the question carried on anywhere. As in all the colonies, the richer Tidewater section was on a whole, now this is talking about Virginia now, the Tidewater section of Virginia, was on a whole overwhelmingly in favor of a strong government. Shays' Rebellion was still fresh in mind, and the proposed Constitution protected property. In Virginia, however, the far western section, looking to problems of interstate trade and the enforcement of the treaty with England, was also, for different reasons, in favor of ratification. One in Massachusetts by only 19 votes out of 355. Approval was won in Virginia, even with the West in favor, by only 10 votes in 168. You see how narrow this thing was to not even being ratified. In June 25th of 1788, in New York, the opposition between the small, rich group on the coast and the interior farmers had no make weight as in Virginia, and New York City had to threaten to secede and enter the Union without the rest of the state before a favorable vote could be secured, and then by only 3 votes in 57. By that time, all other states except North Carolina and Rhode Island had ratified, and there remained no question as to the establishment of the new government. The last of the southern states came in on November 21st, 1789, and of the northern May 29th, 1790. Owing to the way in which the conventions were held, the great opposition manifested everywhere, and the management required to secure the barest of majorities for ratification, it seems impossible to avoid the conclusion that the greater part of the people were opposed to the Constitution. It was not submitted to the people directly. Bingo. It was ratified by the states in convention, by the popular leaders of the states, not the people. There was no direct vote for the Constitution by all allodial freeholders or voters, electors at that time in America. And in those days of generally limited suffrage, even those who voted for delegates to the state conventions were mostly of the property class, although the amount of property called for may have been slight. No one can question that, had the Constitution not been ratified, the old Confederation would have broken down and the states become a quarreling lot of small independent sovereignties. Had the America of 1787 been a pure democracy based on manhood suffrage, such a breakdown would have seemed to have been inevitable. Okay, now this guy is for the Constitution. I'm not. Nevertheless, the sharp corner had been turned. And he goes on to, yay, yay, hurrah, hurrah. We're going to ensnare you, okay? So you can see that not only was it, but the way it was done was a peaceful revolution because it didn't follow the ways of the old Confederation. You can see that the battle just to get ratification was just by the hair of their chinny chin chin, by these oligarchic, commercial, rich, powerful interests. Now, not that there weren't other common men that didn't want it, but most of the commoners did not want the Constitution. And as you can tell by today, it's not your friend. You call on it all the time, but you don't abide by it. The Constitution says that no state shall make anything but gold or silver coin a tender in payment of debt. Are you upholding that sacred part of your Constitution? Are you paying debts with gold and silver coin? No. And the one clause in there that's actually a very good clause, but it works against you, is no state shall make any law impairing the obligations of contracts. But you've contracted yourself with the state. All persons, the state is a person. Any corporation is a person. Okay, a person is a term of civil law, not natural or common law. Person is a legal fiction, whether that's a natural person or an artificial person. It's a legal fiction that's created to operate within the civil law system. So when you contract with the state, that's two persons, a natural person and an artificial person contracting. When you contract with State Farm for insurance, it's an artificial person and a natural person contracting within the commercial law for a policy of insurance to limit your liability. These are all contracts within the civil commercial law for you to engage in commerce. And they got to have that system, and that's why the Constitution gave in Article 1, Section 8 absolute power over interstate and foreign commerce to the Congress, and why it gave the power of admiralty maritime law exclusively to Congress, because that's the jurisdiction of law that rules over commerce. I can show that to you real quick here, but let's get through these. And then we'll kind of bring that in, hopefully, if I remember. Okay, now let's go back again. We see what happened. Let's see how things were before this all took place. Okay, now this is from this same book, but now it's this same book, but now we're back on page 44. Let me turn back here into 44, but we'll do it on the screen because I think it's easier to see. Yeah, here it is. The ordinary citizen living on his farm. Okay, so here I'm kind of done with that book now, so we'll come up here. Before the Declaration of Independence, America was already a pure republic composed of free men. Now, that's because the charters signed by Charles I and Charles II really set everybody free. Now, George III didn't like that so much, and he fought bitterly to get that changed, and then he used monarch fiat to impose stamp acts and things like that, which pissed everybody off. Okay, so now here we go. The ordinary citizen. Now this is kind of citizen, and I should have capitalized that, but we're talking about a mere inhabitant now, not a corporate member. The 14th Amendment citizenship had not been created. So back then, the citizenship was just as an inhabitant, not a corporate member, not a person. Living on his farm, owned in fee simple. That's important. That's allodial freehold. That's an allodial title. We'll cover that here again. I've covered it before in this playlist. Untroubled by any relics of feudalism. See, you're under neo-feudalism now through all these contracts. Untaxed. Saved by himself. And what? Saved by himself. He's got to contract himself into owing a tax. Okay. So he's an allodial freeholder. He's untaxed. Saying his say to all the world in town meetings, had gained a new self-reliance. He was not dependent on anybody, and he couldn't pray to anybody. You know, there was no Social Security, there was no public schools, there was no welfare, there was no bailouts, there was none of that crap. You had to take care of yourself, or you had to rely on neighbors to help you out through love, which is what the Bible talks about. Love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. So when you see your neighbor in need, like John the Baptist said, hey, if you got 2 coats and your neighbor doesn't have a coat, give him a coat. But that goes beyond coats. You know, when you see your neighbor have a bad year with crops, maybe maybe something happened. Maybe he broke his leg and he can't bring in his crops. And his children aren't old enough to bring in that crop. Well, what are you going to do? You going to let that crop go to waste so he starves to death? Or are you going to go over there and harvest that crop for him and bring that in to help him out while he's got a broken leg? Because you know what? Next year you might have the broken leg. Okay? Wrestling with his soul and plow on weekdays and the innumerable points of the minister's sermon on Sundays and meeting days, he was becoming a tough nut for any imperial system to crack. Well, I hate to break it to you, kids, it didn't take long, and those allodial freemen by Reconstruction and definitely by the New Deal were all cracked. And now they're part of the imperial system, contracted in up to over their necks in a Gordian knot, and they are bitching, moaning, and complaining about it, but yet they still think they're free men. Okay? No, kids. You are chattel human resources. Okay, let's see what else we got here. Oh, Sam Adams. Now, you get this now. This is Sam Adams. We just read about Sam throwing up a fit up in Massachusetts trying to ratify the Constitution. Now, check this out. He wrote this. This is from August 1st of 1776. That was within 1 month of the signing of the unanimous declaration, aka the Declaration of Independence. This is when he wrote this. Our union is complete. Our Constitution composed, established, and approved. You are now the guardians of your own liberties. How many people think today that they are the guardians of their own liberties, or do they think the state has to protect their liberty? We may justly address you as the decemviri did the Romans, and say nothing that we propose can pass into law without your consent. Be yourself, O Americans, the authors of those laws on which your happiness depends. Again, Sam Adams on August 1st, 1776. Now I put a little note here. What? 1776, Constitution composed, established, and approved in 1776? Adams must be insane, right? The Articles of Confederation, the first corporate charter creating the corporate federal agent, wasn't ratified until 1781. And the silent coup that became the U.S. Constitution wasn't acquiesced to until 1787. Oh, wait. Adams isn't insane. He's referring to the true and pure republic, where free men are the rulers of their own lives, living on allodial estates not taxed, where the rule of unanimous consent reigns supreme to protect the rights of all free men, male and female. Just so you know, a decemvirate is a council of 10 counselors, 10 advisors, or assistants to help a free man decide matters of law. Your decemvirate should be your best 10 closest trusted advisors. And those are the people that you should go to that aren't just going to scratch your back, slap you on the back, and blow smoke up your rear end, but they should challenge you. They're going to push you. So anytime you think about going in and doing something stupid, you want to talk to these 10 first. See what they say as counsel. That's what the scriptures, the natural law, tell us to do. There's safety in a multitude of counsel. We need to return to following that. But you got to have smart, educated, well-informed people in order to be these decemvirate advisors to you. Okay. So we can see before the Constitution, you were already a allodial freeman. Now let me remind you what allodial is. Allodial, free, not holden of any lord or superior, i.e. the state or the fifth plank central bank, owned without obligation of vassalage or fealty, excise taxes, registration, licenses, the opposite of feudal. Allodium, land held absolutely in one's own right and not of any lord or superior. The state, government is what I'm talking about here, banks, etc. Land not subject to feudal duties, taxes, easements, assessments, registration, etc., or burdens, permits, building permits, licenses, codes, use statutes, etc. An estate held by an absolute ownership without recognizing any superior to whom any duty is due on account thereof. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition, page 70. Homo liber, a free man, an allodial proprietor, as distinguished from a vassal or feudatory. A free man lawfully competent to act as a common or natural law juror. Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition. Because in a common or natural law jury, the jury decides both fact and law. In a civil law, commercial law setting, you can just get a bench trial where the judge does it, which is typical, or they can bring in a jury to judge the facts of the case, and that's usually for murder or something, some other larger crime. They'll bring in this jury that is subject citizens that can judge the facts, but they can't judge the law. In a common law or natural law setting, the juror is the judge and the jury. They decide both fact and law, because common law allodial freemen don't need a jury. And let's pull that up. Anyway, we'll get there too. I'll try to add that. Okay, so now let's take a look at we the people. So I put these in no particular order. I just, they're just the way they are. I thought this one was really interesting. Though the president is commander-in-chief, which under Roman terms that's called imperator, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Congress is his commander, and God willing, he shall obey. He and his minions shall learn that this is not a government of kings and satraps, but a government of the people, and Congress is the people, i.e. the popular leaders, the people, we the people. See Blackstone's below. Thaddeus Stevens, chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee during the U.S. Civil War. So Blackstone's Commentaries is talking about the English common law, which is where our law originally came from. Our common law was the original English common law, and that carried over here. And that's where most of our legal concepts come from. Great Britain and the United States share a very ancient judicial commonality through law and justice. Okay? So in Blackstone's Commentaries on the English common law, which were relied to very heavily by the drafters of all law in the colonies and in the United States very early on, not so much after the Civil War. Civil law replaced the common law during the Civil War. Here's what Blackstone said in his commentaries on common law about this phrase, people. The popular leaders, who in all ages have called themselves the people, as in we, comma, the people. Okay? As in we, the people. Originally equal we, the popular leaders. That's why Patrick Henry was bitching about this. Okay? Because he knew that the guys writing the Constitution were doing it as delegates from the states. They're signing it. They're the ones that are creating it. And they're having to bring it back to the states for those governments to ratify in convention. Not a vote of the popular people. It was not a vote of the people. It was never put to the people. This phrase is killing you. You think you're part of the we the people. No, never were and aren't today. So, we the people, the popular leaders of the United States, then presented to the states for ratification. We the people, the popular leaders of the United States, did not present their constitution to the general populace of all the states to vote on in a popular democratic vote. The private person, a state citizen, state national at that time, an inhabitant, a common law, allodial freeholder, was not a party to the U.S. Constitution. Was not a party to the U.S. Constitution. Only we the people, the men that signed the compact, we the people of the United States now, and the states were the original parties to the agreement. We the people, the signers and popular leaders of the United States, created a corporate body, politic, for themselves and their posterity, not for the people of the state or any state citizen or state national allodial freeman. Now, let's scroll down a little further here. Take it another court case. The Supreme Court of Georgia, in the case of Paddleford Fay and MP Company versus Mayor and Alderman, City of Savannah, 14 Georgia, 438, 520 in 1854. Now this is my little note, which was prior to the 14th Amendment. No private person, common natural law, allodial freeman, has a state citizen, state national, whatever you want to say, has no right to complain by suit in court on the grounds of breach of Constitution. You get that? The Constitution, it is true, is a compact, but he is not a party to it. Did any ancestor of yours sign the Constitution? Did any ancestor of yours vote for the Constitution? Now, if so, you're the posterity. But I doubt seriously that the elite group that's running this show today, that are all posterity of that, are going to let you in. I'm one of those. I have several ancestors who were part of this, but I'm not part of their club. The states, corporations, are a party to it. This precedent was firmly established in the case of Barron versus City of Baltimore, 32 U.S. 243 in 1833 by the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court statement that avowed the first 10 articles in amendment, what we call the Bill of Rights, was applying to pre-14th Amendment state citizens, state nationals. Okay? You 14th Amendment citizen, the 14th Amendment is not about gun rights. That is a common law, natural law right that existed prior to the establishment of the Constitution. It wasn't granted to you by any government. It was already there. It's not a right of 14th Amendment U.S. citizens. Ouch. We might look at that someday. This precedent, so here we go. Here's what the U.S. Supreme Court said in Barron versus Baltimore, City of Baltimore. The Constitution was ordained and established by the people of the United States. Originally, just the guys who signed it, the popular leaders, for themselves, for their own government, and not for the government of the individual states. Each state established a constitution for itself, its corporate charter, and in that Constitution provided such limitations and restrictions on the powers of its particular government as its judgment dictated. The people of the United States, again, see Blackstone's definition above, frame such a government for the United States as they suppose best adapted to their situation and best calculated to promote their interests. Again, what interests were that of the Federalists? Commercial. That's why the U.S. Constitution rests so much power of commerce and all of that into the hands of Congress and the executive. If expressed in general terms, are naturally and necessarily applicable to the government created by the instrument. They are limitations of power granted in the instrument itself, not of distinct governments framed by different persons and for different purposes. So some men got together to form a body politic called the United States. And it's a federal agent that was ratified and created by the authority of the state governments, who in convention ratified it by the narrowest of margins. And if it had been put to a popular vote, it would have been voted down. So a few more little tidbits here, and then we'll open up some new ones that I kind of mentioned, and we'll take a look at those things. This is from the book Contracts, Covenants, and Constitutions by Greg Williams. Page 4. An absolute or fee simple estate is one in which the owner, this is like a allodial now, entitled to the entire property with unconditional power of disposition during his life and descending to his heirs and legal representatives upon his death intestate without a will. Okay? Unconditional power. Now, let me ask you something. If you own a house, if you think you own a house, let's say you got your mortgage paid off and the bank is no longer, you don't think the bank has an equitable interest in it. Let's say you think you own that house. Hey, you want to build a new house and you want to get rid of this old one, so you decide to burn it down, so you got a spot to build a new house. Can you do that? Do you have unconditional power to do whatever you want and dispose of that property any way you want? Of course you don't. That's because you don't really own it. You have a mere legal title, not an allodial title. You're not a common law free man, an allodial proprietor. You are a serf that has a mere legal title to possess and use, and you've got to follow all these rules and regulations of the superior parties who have a superior ownership interest in that, namely the central bank and the state, who's your daddy under parens patriae. Go watch the first couple of videos. Do you really own that, and why did you make the state your father? Okay, let's continue on here. The first farmer was the first man, and all historic nobility rests on possession and use of land. Now, that's Ralph Waldo Emerson. It didn't say specifically where that was from, but that's from him. Freeman means the possessor of allodial lands, and we've covered what allodial is in a previous one here. In Lansing versus Smith, 21D 89, it is written, people of a state are entitled to all rights which formerly belonged to the king by his prerogative. Freedom in America was not due to the collective Declaration of Independence, but rather the result of tens and thousands of individual independent declarations in words and deeds. How you do stuff. If you got to be taken care of by the state and you need to contract with the state to make sure you have all these safety nets that tough nut didn't need, but you've been cracked, and you need those things, well, then you're not a free man in America. Those declarations began a century before, and at the success of the conflict of freemen was truly king of his castle under God alone. The virtue that settled the wilderness and earned the freedoms of the early Americans are not automatically carried from generation to generation. Boy, isn't that the truth. And here we're going to see it stated by Thomas Paine. When we are planning for posterity, we ought to remember that virtue is not hereditary. You want to know why America's turned into a pile of communist crap, where the government rules over you with everything? Try to do something of any value without a license from the government, permission from your master. That's because virtue in America, real virtue, real righteousness, real self-reliance, that tough nut that James Truslow Adams wrote about, is gone. You got to get it back. At the beginning of the original Ten Commandments movie by Cecil B. DeMille, he came out on stage and he said this: "Are men the property of the state, or are they free souls under God? This same battle continues throughout the world." Something you ought to ponder. I believe that there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those powers than by violent and sudden usurpations. Who said that? James Madison, 4th President of the United States. Was he trying to tell you something, or was he part of the cabal that wanted to take it away from you slowly and gradually so you wouldn't, like a frog in a pot? Okay. All right. So as you can see, you ain't we the people. Like George Carlin said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. So let me see if I can find a couple of those things here. What was it? Oh, let's do admiralty. Do a couple of those just to throw that in there. Although there's a video about that, we'll just kind of read a few of those here. This comes from one of these books up here. Somewhere there's Admiralty. American Jurisprudence 2D, Volume 2. Oh, Volume 2. Okay. Yeah, all right. Page 720, Admiralty. Section 1, the origin and nature of Admiralty jurisprudence, jurisdiction and practice. The historical development of Admiralty jurisdiction and procedure is of practical as well as theoretical interest, since opinions in Admiralty cases frequently refer to the historical background in reaching conclusions on the questions at issue. The special jurisdiction of Admiralty has a maritime purpose and is different from common law. Admiralty is not exclusively rooted in the civil law system, although it includes substantial derivations therefrom. That's because Admiralty actually developed a long time ago. So it's not civil law is actually the law a civil people make for themselves. And it originated, this modern concept of civil law comes out of Rome. But Admiralty goes back to ancient, in its modern form, goes back to the ancient Isle of Rhodes. So it's very civil law-ish, but we don't say that it's actually civil, from the civil law. But it's incorporated into your civil law, and I can show you that. It has a strong international aspect, but it may undergo independent changes in the several countries that have an Admiralty law, and such international features are given serious consideration by Admiralty courts. By the end of the 17th century, the Admiralty jurisdiction in England had been restricted until it was not as extensive as in other European maritime countries due to a long controversy in which the common law courts, with the aid of Parliament, had succeeded in limiting the jurisdiction of Admiralty to the high seas and excluding its jurisdiction from transactions arising on waters within the body of a country. The development of Admiralty in the United States. The Admiralty jurisprudence system was brought to America by British settlers. along with the common law and equity. Now, equity is said to follow the law. It'll follow both admiralty and common law. Equity gives you a remedy when no remedy exists in either one of these other two forms, or in civil law. Okay, equity follows the law. So the best example of equity that I can give you is Solomon and the baby out of the Bible. Nowhere in the law of God does it deal with the question of what do you do when two women are bitching over who's the mother of a child. Why? Because it sounds absurd on its face, so there's no reason for that law. But human nature being what it is, you got two women bitching, moaning, complaining over who is the mother of this child. So what comes into play? Equity. And Solomon used equity to figure out who has the best interest of the child at heart. So he said, let's just saw the baby in half and give each woman half of the baby. And of course, one of them said, okay, good, that's a good idea. And the other one said, no, that'll kill the baby, give it to her. Well, the woman that had the best interest of the child at heart, whether she was the mother or not, we all assume she was the mother, but we don't know that. It doesn't specifically state that. That's who Solomon gave custody of the baby over because she had the best interest of that's equity. Judge Judy is equity, okay? But any federal judge can wear a common law hat, he can wear an admiralty maritime hat, or he can put on an equity hat or a statutory law hat, okay? The courts for the administration of the maritime law were commissioned in many, if not all, of the colonies. These tribunals continued to exercise of the power conferred upon them until the organization of the federal government in 1787. Now, before the adoption of the Constitution, jurisdiction in admiralty and maritime cases was distributed between the Confederation of the individual states. But when the Constitution of the United States was framed, a system of exclusive federal admiralty jurisdiction. Why? Well, because that's what those guys wanted. They were commercial men. Those guys that signed the document were very much into commerce. Under national control because of its intimate, skipped one. Was incorporated, placing the entire subject, substantive as well as procedural, under national control because of its intimate relation to navigation and to interstate and foreign commerce. Now, the provision of the Constitution did not abrogate the maritime law theretofore in force. So whatever maritime law had been, it was still going to carry over. The maritime law became law of the United States, subject to the paramount power of Congress. Paramount power of Congress, Article 1, Section 8, to alter, qualify, or supplement it as experience and changing conditions might require, subject only to constitutional and treaty limitations. Oops, I got to scroll up here. The power of Congress is paramount in matters of maritime law, and it was exercised at an early date when Congress enacted the Judiciary Act of 1789, conferring on the federal district courts exclusive jurisdiction of seizures under the law of impost, navigation, or trade of the United States, and made on navigable waters within the respective districts. This jurisdiction of admiralty has since been modified and enlarged